A reflection today about 9/11 from a different point of view, from one pivotal moment in 44 years of decisions. That's Cal, the guitar hero. He hits you with that guitar in this intro. He's also one of the most unique and amazing people that I know. He's the guitarist with the Color 8 band based in Phoenix. Check him out wherever you stream your music. It's a really interesting, eclectic mix. So life is made up of a series of choices. Your fate is determined by those decisions that you make, those choices that you make. Those decisions have the ability to offer you wisdom if you're courageous enough to learn from your decisions. Now, some of the decisions that you make as a person are consequential because they ripple through time in your entire life. Well, today, let's zoom out and look back on decisions made on behalf of a country after a pivotal moment and before a pivotal moment. That pivotal moment was 9:03 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on September 11th, 2001.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. Two airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act.
It was 9:03 when the second plane hit United Airlines Flight 175. It hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center. And when that second plane hit, we knew it was war. We knew it was an attack. We knew it because we watched it on television. It wasn't just a fluke that the first plane hit. So 9:03 became that pivotal moment of which consequential decisions would be made. For the past 22 years, we've been reminded all the time, every year, to never forget, as if that's possible. So today, we're zooming out to examine the consequential decisions that were made by the people that we as a country decided to vote for. We're going to break this up into two parts. Part 2, out next week, we'll examine the 22 years after that pivotal moment, 9:03 a.m., 9/11/01. Today, we rewind the clock 22 years back to other decisions to see how they all relate, like a pebble being thrown into a lake, ripples all the way out. Small decisions, big consequences. It also happens that this right here at 22 years, the anniversary of 9/11, is the perfect way to look back because of where we start. We're right in the middle of all of this. And in the 22 years since, we know what's happened, right? Wars, spending, illegal domestic spying. Don't get me started on that. And I'm learning lessons in my own life and how to apply them to politics. Because ultimately, I know this. I'm only in control of me. The things that I say, the things that I do, how I say them. I can't control what you say. I can't control what you think. You can't control what I think. And when it comes to control in our government, we don't have any. But we do have control over who we vote for and how we vote and how we think about voting. So oddly enough, at the age of 22, I made this consequential decision that continues to ripple through my life. A decision that led to more decisions. And eventually deciding to look back at those decisions and taking full responsibility for them. Stop making excuses. Because the excuses part is what we often get caught up on. We make excuses for our behavior. I did. Sometimes I still do. And we do that for our government as well. Because I think that there is such a challenge in looking at some of these issues more deeply than we do. Because I have decided recently to really examine my personal responsibility in how I vote. And did I contribute to some of these decisions by picking politicians? And doing it, artfully. Because oftentimes, how many times have you heard this? Well, I'm voting for the lesser of two evils. I refuse to believe that that's the only way. that we have to vote for the lesser of two evils. Because right now, party doesn't matter, decisions do. And I think that if we take responsibility as a country for what our leaders have done, we'll take some more ownership of it. We might decide that we're going to vote a little bit differently. We're going to look for different candidates to run for office. Now, this isn't to slight the former presidents that have to make the toughest decisions in the world. It's to point out how those decisions impact you, because we never really do this. Decisions are what shape our lives. And decisions are what shapes a country's future. So as we've discussed here on Equal Matters, a show about realism, depth, and knowledge, we've covered some of the big decisions future presidents and members of Congress are going to have to make. How to manage $33 trillion in debt and counting. How to handle Social Security and Medicare going forward. Two of our largest programs, the two largest programs in the federal government, both running out of money. 9 years, we're going to double senior poverty unless we act. Decisions have to be made in a fractured political environment. And those are just naming a few. But these are decisions future politicians are going to have to make. And these are decisions that are going to impact all of us. What role do you want to have in determining this fate of this country? So my adult life, my name is Rob Hunter, has been spent researching and discussing America, our culture, and our politics, and looking ahead towards our future. And all of this is a result of a consequential decision I made at the age of 22 that I mentioned. That decision is taking a massive risk and moving to Florida from Massachusetts. Now, this is a decision that continues to pay dividends for me to this day. It was a great decision, and it has expanded my life in so many consequential ways. A decision that collided with that pivotal moment for America, 9:03 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 9/11/01. Because it was in that moment that I made a big decision. I was going to become a talk show host that discussed news, politics, and culture. And as a radio talk show host for the past 22 years, I've had access to politicians and journalists and think tanks, all kinds of research. Matter of fact, I've been researching 9/11 since that day. And this research has informed me to zoom out like I did in my own life and look at the consequential decisions made by American politicians. Zooming out is a practice that allows us to look at the response to find out what we can learn from those decisions. The same thing I applied to my own life and saying, why did I do that? And instead of making excuses, actually telling myself the truth. Because there is a boldness, a courage in telling yourself the truth. That boldness and courage is happening right now to tell ourselves the truth about how our government operates. Understanding that these are human beings making the most difficult decisions. But those decisions really, really matter. And when you look back at your own life and you look at those decisions, you really figure that out. And one of the best ways to do that is take a view from above. I mentioned this before. The Stoics used to do this. The ancient Stoics, the philosophers, who really were the original personal development coaches, is the way that I look at that. So a view from above, imagine it this way. Look at your house. Look at it from the inside. Now imagine looking at it from 100 feet above your house. You can see your roof. You can see your yard. Maybe there's a tree in the backyard. I got a mesquite tree in the backyard. And I'm looking at all of that. Now, if I go up even higher, I go up 1,000 feet, my view starts to expand a little bit. Yeah, I can't necessarily see all the little nuances in the yard, but now I can see my neighbors. And then I can see them across the street. I can see my street. And if you keep zooming out, you keep getting higher in the air. You start looking at your house, say 30,000 feet in the air like you would on an airplane. You can see all kinds of things. You can see a city, a region, a mountain. But that's the clarity that you can get because you get out of the day-to-day, which is what we're going to do today on part one. We're going to expand our field of vision. We're going to see how things fit together. We're going to see how those decisions really impact an entire country, an entire region in the Middle East. So we'll do this for our government, and I'm going to encourage you to do the same thing for you if you haven't, because it creates awareness. Awareness is massive because it's a key to unlocking a future that you are in control of. Awareness is also the first step to understanding. Understanding is what allows you to examine the lessons that you can learn from your decisions, or in today's case, our country's decisions. Because I look at this country as a collective, not as Republicans, Democrats. Parties don't matter, decisions do. Because you go back in history, it doesn't matter who is a Democrat and a Republican because the results are real regardless. So going back to awareness, which breeds understanding, which breeds lessons, lessons that can inform us to make better decisions in the present. For me, moving to Florida at the age of 22 introduced me to this eventual profession, a profession that, thankfully for me, has taken me all over the country. A decision that really ties into that pivotal moment on 9/11 at 9:03 a.m. A decision that eventually led me to plenty of personal reflection through that lens of personal responsibility called the dichotomy of control. Because decisions have these ripple effects on you as a person, and when the government does it, the politicians do it as a country. So on 9/11, I was at work. It was my first radio station job as a professional. And at the time, in 2001, I wasn't quite sure which direction I wanted to go. I'm just happy to have a job in the industry that I studied in college. In college, all I wanted to do was a hip-hop radio show. That's what drove me to Emerson College in Boston, and I went and I did that. And when I graduated, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to figure out how to play hip-hop on the radio, but it just wasn't in the cards. So I decided to move to Florida because the jobs in Boston where I was living just weren't there. Mrs. Hunter lived in Florida. She wasn't Mrs. Hunter at the time, but she was cute and she was smart and fun to be around, and I kind of dug her, so I'm like, I'm going to take a chance and move to Florida. And in moving to Florida, she lived in this small part of Florida, this place called Ocala. It's right in the middle of the state, northern part. It's not near any beaches. When you think of Florida, you don't think of Ocala. However, people from Florida love it because it's really the only place in Florida that has hills and horses and green. So I guess there is a certain charm to it, but as a 22-year-old recent college graduate, that's the last place you wanted to live. But sometimes careers require sacrifice. So I made that decision. And I had a connection, luckily so. My cousin knew a guy who was running a radio station, and they were looking for a part-timer on a Saturday night, 7 p.m. to 1 a.m. to press some buttons, play some commercials. Exactly the opposite of what a 22-year-old college graduate wants to do, but I did it anyways. I made that decision. And that decision led to more hours, and that decision eventually led to producing the morning show. That show that I was producing that morning on 9/11, it just ended at 9. We were on from 6 to 9, and we heard the news anchor, Doug Limerick from ABC News, say something to the effect that there was a tragedy in the making in New York City. So Greg Knapp, the host, and I ran into our little newsroom where it had the TV. It was on the Weather Channel at the time. We changed the channel. And about 30 seconds later, the second plane hit. That pivotal moment, I remember Greg said, "We're under attack. Go run in and put ABC News on." So I run into the radio studio, pop the microphone on, I press the button, I turn it on, and I say, "We're now going to ABC News live because 2 planes have struck the World Trade Center in New York." And it was in those moments I found a purpose. And that purpose for me was to look at events like this and try to tell the truth the best way that I could. So in that pivotal moment, in finding that purpose, it was something so shocking and devastating that it's the only thing I could think to do because I wanted to help. And I viewed being a talk show host as a public service, and I still do to this day. Which is why I'm doing this today, which is why I want to go back 22 years in time, and I want to show you the decisions that were made. And these are decisions that are completely relevant to today. Because if you think about the circumstances and you think about where we're at, we're almost at that same point. Because if we go back 22 years prior to 9/11, on July 3rd, 1979, Jimmy Carter, Democrat president of the United States, allowed the CIA to fund a group called the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. The Mujahideen were rebelling against, at the time, communist influence in Afghanistan. But that communist influence had reached out to the Soviet Union, and eventually, December 24th, 1979.
On December 24th, 1979, the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. The first Soviet invasion of a country outside the Eastern Bloc since World War II. Modern tanks and sophisticated technology were pitted against the poorly armed and politically divided tribes of Afghanistan warriors.
But that money kept flowing in. That money was a big reason why the Mujahideen were able to repel the Russians. The Russians had a very difficult time in Afghanistan, just as we did, which we'll talk about in part 2 next week. But the Russians invade Afghanistan, and the American money starts to increase. The first payment was only $500,000, but they gradually started to increase and increase and increase. And eventually the Mujahideen fights off the Russians. It's almost unbelievable. It's like David versus Goliath. And David won. Beat the big bad Russians. And for the United States, oh man, Cold War victory. We didn't have to fight the war. We get to do it via proxy. Doesn't that sound familiar to what we're doing right now? Because oddly, right, there's so many 22s in this. I was 22 when I made the consequential decision to move to Florida to pursue my career, my dreams. Consequential decision that bumped into a pivotal moment on 9/11. 22 years prior to that, the money starts flowing into Afghanistan. 22 years after that, we're now. 22, the year, Russians invade another country, Ukraine. America fights it via proxy. So that's why looking at these decisions is very relevant to what we do today. And you might be thinking to yourself, oh, but Rob, I only have one vote. That's fine, but it's defeatist attitude, right? Going back to the lesser of two evils, how many times have you thought that or heard that when it comes to voting? I get it. I've done it too. I voted third party. I voted Republican. I voted Democrat. I've done it all. I'm just over the partisanship. I want to look at the decisions, and I want to judge the candidates that run for future office by the decisions that they will make. Because these decisions do have massive consequences. Now, I'm not saying that in 1979 Jimmy Carter had any idea that 22 years later a plane, too, would fly into the World Trade Center, one in the Pentagon, and one would crash because of brave passengers in Pennsylvania. I'm not saying that, nor am I blaming him. It's just a realization of how power works, how decisions work. And the other part about that decision by Carter in 79 that is so apparent to me is how secret it was. Conducted in the dark with your money, behind closed doors, big deal. Because again, who cares about Afghanistan in 1979? Well, apparently the Russians. But here's where things get interesting, because the Mujahideen were a bunch of really good fighters. Come from a country that is technologically disadvantaged, so they're hardened. They live hard, a lot harder than we live. So they put up a good fight. And this fight actually attracted other people from around the Arab world to come contribute. One of those people was a guy named Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was an Afghan Arab, Saudi background, rich family, but for some reason is attracted to this cause in Afghanistan, so he goes. And he brings some of his own money, and he sets up his own training camps. And the Afghan Arabs were a part of the fight. Now, technically speaking, there's no direct evidence that says CIA, United States money directly reached the hand of bin Laden. But it doesn't matter. Because this isn't just about the direct money. Bin Laden definitely benefited from being around the Mujahideen, not just from a money standpoint, from a training and tactics standpoint. That's the part that bin Laden starts to formulate his own group with. He starts to get these bigger, grander, broader visions about what the Mujahideen could be. So 9 years after Jimmy Carter decides to pay the Mujahideen, Osama bin Laden officially forms Al-Qaeda. The date, August 11th, 1988. So how much is it directly related to Jimmy Carter's decision? It's tough to say. But it does have a role. And it's worth examining because, again, we find ourselves in this situation. Yeah, Ukraine is different from Afghanistan, but no one thought the wiser when it came to Afghanistan that many years ago. Ukraine has more technological advantages than Afghanistan. Know-how. And now there's a bunch of hardened fighters there. I don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to happen, but they're consequential decisions to fight the Russians via proxy. So 1979, 9 years later, Al-Qaeda is formed by Osama bin Laden. That next year, 1989, the Russians finally leave Afghanistan. So the Russians leave Afghanistan. America continues to fund Afghanistan for a few more years until Afghanistan collapsed in 1992 after a 3-year civil war. Now, 1992 is also an interesting year because that is the year after America goes to war with Iraq.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait. These attacks continue as I speak. Ground forces are not engaged. This conflict started August 2nd when the dictator of Iraq invaded a small and helpless neighbor. Kuwait, a member of the Arab League and a member of the United Nations, was crushed. Its people brutalized. 5 months ago, Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined.
This impacted bin Laden in big ways. A decision by an American president, a Republican this time, George H.W. Bush. And the parallels here are so crazy, aren't they? Because obviously we know that his son, W. Bush, also did the same thing, decided to go to war with Iraq, which we'll get more into in episode 2 of this Pivotal Moment series next week here on Equal Matters. Equal Matters for knowledge, depth, and broadening our perspectives. That's the point of this. Because you look at these decisions, you look at the ripple effects, and you look at the parallels, and you start to wonder about these decisions. So let's recap real quick. 1979, the Russians invade Afghanistan. The Mujahideen that are fighting the Russians are getting American money. Getting American money until 1992. In the meantime, Al-Qaeda is formed by bin Laden. Bin Laden around the Mujahideen as an Afghan Arab. Sets up his own training camps. Bin Laden at one point says Americans trained his people, but then later said he never witnessed Americans training his people. But that's besides the point because the training always comes back to that for me. That's the stuff that you don't write down on paper. And in the meantime, 3 years after that, H.W. Bush goes to war with Iraq. That's what bin Laden didn't like because bin Laden wanted to take his Al-Qaeda forces and his Mujahideen and he wanted to defend Kuwait. He thought it was a good thing to do at the time because it kept it in-house, so to speak. The Arab world defending the Arab world against the Arab world. But instead, Saudi Arabia got involved, called the big bad Americans, and H.W. Bush says, heck yeah, we're coming in. Kuwait's got oil. Saudi's a friend. We're doing what we got to do. So now we have a war that we paid for, at least in part, in Afghanistan from 79 to 89. Now, 2 years after that, America is getting involved in a war. And that war doesn't last very long. Saddam goes back. Kuwait is safe. And we think everything is safe. So after the war, the next year in 1992, America has an election, and we decide that H.W. Bush, it's time to go. We decided that, as a country, to put a younger guy named Bill Clinton in office. And one of the first things that he faced as a brand new president, a month into his administration on February 26, 1993, the World Trade Center bombing in New York, the first one.
What an extraordinary afternoon here in Lower Manhattan. All day long, Ernie, it's been a search for information. Dazed victims of the smoke, the fire, people in their offices one moment, the next moment crowding into stairwells, some of them going over 100 stories down, to breathe the fresh air, or relatively fresh air, at street level. All day long, all city officials wondering what caused this. Could it be among the miles of the cables that run under Lower Manhattan that power structures like the World Trade Center? Was it transformers? Well, now comes word, at least unofficially, sources reporting that it was in fact a bomb that blew up in the parking level underneath the World Trade Center, causing all this, causing a virtual standstill and terror in Lower Manhattan. We're now going with the figure from a high-ranking NYFD, a fire department source, of 4 dead in this terrible explosion.
Think about the way, that was Brian Williams, by the way, formerly the NBC News anchor at the time. He was working at a New York news station reporting live. This again in 1993 after the World Trade Center bombing. It was a shock that it was a bomb. A shock. Nobody knew who Al-Qaeda was at that point. But this was bin Laden making a big decision, a big move, a bold move to strike America, to strike New York. And obviously the foreshadowing there, because the plan by Ramzi Youssef, the bomber, was to use enough explosives to topple one of the towers into the other. It didn't quite work that way, but Youssef says, we'll get it next time. He said that. I think when he got arrested, when they were taking him to the station. Again, foreshadowing. So think about how all those things connect, right? Decision by Jimmy Carter to pay the Mujahideen to fight in Afghanistan, which at least gives bin Laden some exposure to war, to tactics, and to thinking about war. So he knew with Al-Qaeda, he didn't have a standing army like the United States, but he had fighters who were war-hardened, scrappy, survivors, know how to use the weapons, effective. So he doesn't get the call to defend Iraq because the United States does. So 2 years later, he somehow gets Ramzi Youssef to mix a bomb and drive it into the World Trade Center. The decisions matter, and they have ripple effects. Something else worth noting, that 1 year and a half after the World Trade Center bombing in 93, a new group starts to emerge in Afghanistan after the Afghan Civil War, which lasted 3 years from 89 to 92 after the Russians were expelled. This new group in September of 1994 that comes along is the Taliban. Now, it also gets more interesting because the Taliban leadership also fought in those wars, some with the Mujahideen, which were again funded by America. So now you have the organization that ends up taking over most of Afghanistan in 2001 and protects Al-Qaeda starting in 1994, again with war-hardened leaders trained and paid by America. So 1994, Bill Clinton's still the president, the Taliban, Afghanistan, no one cares. Don't blame him, not a big deal. Bill Clinton, for the most part, seems inclined not to get involved in the Middle East. And then Al-Qaeda starts stepping up their attacks. So bin Laden orders a bombing of the Khobar Towers. It happened on June 25th, 1996, Saudi Arabia. I believe the number is 19 U.S. servicemen were killed in that bombing. Al-Qaeda, again, showcasing their ability to wage terrorism. So they've already struck New York. Now they've struck Saudi Arabia. And around this time, Al-Qaeda starts to get noticed a little bit more because they've had 2 major terrorist attacks, and I think they had another couple that they attempted in the meantime that just didn't go as planned. But they're getting involved around the world. They're showcasing creativity when it comes to terrorism and how to strike fear into people's hearts. So 1996, the Khobar Towers, bin Laden gains some notoriety, ends up doing an interview on CNN for the first time that year.
You have declared a jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
The U.S. government has committed acts that are extremely unjust, hideous, and criminal through its support of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. and we believe the U.S. is directly responsible for those killed in Palestine, Lebanon, and Iraq. Due to its subordination to the Jews, the arrogance of the United States regime has reached the point that they occupied Arabia, the holiest place of the Muslims, who are more than 1 billion people in the world today. For this and other acts of aggression and injustice, we have declared jihad against the U.S.
Jihad is holy war. So in 1997 on CNN and a broadcast audience around the world, a terrorist gets to declare a war against the United States. And if you think back to the 20 years prior to that, 18 to be more specific, when the Russians invaded Afghanistan to this point where bin Laden goes on CNN and says, I'm coming after America. I've already come after America. Not just in the World Trade Center bombing in 93, but the Khobar Towers. I was targeting American service members in 1996. So bin Laden continued. The threats were there. But on August 7th, 1998, al-Qaeda struck the U.S. embassies in both Nairobi, Kenya, and the capital of Tanzania. 2 strikes, same day. Different approach. Decisions matter. Decisions have ripple effects. Obviously, this is not to cast blame. It's to look at these decisions because we can't undo what's already happened. One of my favorite mantras to remind myself of, whatever happened, happened. It couldn't have happened any other way. It just helps me shift the focus to the now instead of what could have happened. So this isn't looking at these decisions and saying that they were bad decisions, poor decisions, because they are the toughest decisions. These decisions are here to remind us of what's at stake when we vote. Who we put in office matters. What responsibility they take for those decisions matters. How they think about those decisions that they make and the consequences matter. Because if you look back at this 22-year record and you saw all these American involvements, we look now and go, doesn't matter what your opinion is, this is an opportunity for us to learn. One of the key tenets here at Equal Matters is just that. It's knowledge. Because knowledge helps you understand. It helps you grow. It helps you look back at your life and say, hey, that was a great decision. Look what it led to. Or that wasn't such a great decision because look what it led to. And then if you take that lesson of look what it led to, good or bad, you apply it to another decision, either to inform you to make a better decision or to repeat. Because we all have patterns, decisions that we make over and over and over and over again that we somehow can't break. Flying up and zooming out and using the view from above that we've been doing here with these decisions, some of the key decisions in the 22 years prior to 9/11, you start to see the pattern. You start to see, wow, that one tiny decision for Jimmy Carter to sign a document to send $500,000 to this group called the Mujahideen in Afghanistan turned out to be a pretty big $500,000 because it eventually would go on to become billions of dollars. One year it was $630 million in funding. And that was funding that lasted, as I mentioned, for 13 years. So the United States, through 2 full presidencies, 3 full terms, 1 for Carter, 2 for Reagan, continued to fund Afghanistan. Continued to propel a war in Afghanistan, of which al-Qaeda used to hide out. But it gets even better because let's rewind the clock on the al-Qaeda going after America. 1993, the World Trade Center bombing. 1996, Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia. 98, the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. Former President Bill Clinton had a chance to get bin Laden in what was one of the toughest decisions a president has to make.
And I'm just saying, if I were Osama bin Laden, he's a very smart guy. I spent a lot of time thinking about him. And I nearly got him once. I nearly got him. And I could have killed him, but I would have had to destroy a little town called Kandahar in Afghanistan and kill 300 innocent women and children. And then I would have been no better than him. And so I didn't do it.
That decision not to do it, not to kill bin Laden by Bill Clinton was in 1998. He doesn't know what we know now. He knows bin Laden's a bad dude. He knows bin Laden's responsible for the World Trade Center bombing, the Khobar Towers, Kenya and Tanzania U.S. embassies. But is that worth taking out 300 people, innocent women and children amongst them? He didn't think so. And honestly, I'm not sure that I could say that I would, because the 1998 knowledge is not the 2001 knowledge. But still, it's a consequential decision, right? Because let's imagine that Clinton had done it politically in 1998 and gets back that he killed kids. How would that make him look? Because that's a factor here in these decisions, because politics and politicians always want to be liked enough at least to win the next election. So it's automatic in their brains that when presidents and senators and congressmen and women make their decisions, they're often doing it in some way, shape, or form for their own benefit, or because they think it's good strategy for the United States of America. And if you look at these decisions, I wonder if you would think the same thing, because the terrorism did not stop in 1998, either before or after Bill Clinton didn't kill bin Laden, because on October 12, 2000, al-Qaeda struck again, this time a U.S. warship, the USS Cole, in Yemen. I remember the footage, too, because this was really when I was first getting into talk radio. There's that huge hole in the side. And, this was such a major consequence, right? Right around the election, and the future of America would be decided in that next year. October 12th, 2000, USS Cole. So now we have the World Trade Center bombing, the Khobar Towers, Kenya and Tanzania U.S. embassies, and the USS Cole. 4 major terror attacks by al-Qaeda, taking the lives of Americans. One inside of America. So the election comes, and the election goes, and the election is disputed in 2000. You might remember it. This was the first election that I covered as a talk show host, the Bush-Gore election. And I wasn't completely sold on talk radio yet at this point, but I remember thinking, when it came down to the Supreme Court, and we didn't have a president, we know who's going to be the president until December. Another decision, right? That potentially sets back a transition, sets behind a new administration to look at the decisions that were made by the previous presidents to maybe adjust course, shift strategies. But there wasn't enough time for that. Because what's so crazy about that Bill Clinton audio soundbite that I just played you is that he said that quote about his 1998 decision on September 10th, 2001. And it is a reminder of the tough decisions that presidents have to make. And it's a reminder of the tough decisions that you've had to make in your own life and will have to continue to make. But those decisions that you make now, if you look back at your previous decisions and you're honest with yourself and you put your excuses aside, when you do that, you have better answers, better decision-making abilities now. Because that's what I think is so missing from this country right now, at least politically. And again, I've been involved in politics since that consequential decision that ties into this pivotal moment to go and be a talk show host. Because I viewed it as a public servant that I was, that my job still is to this day to try to give you a different perspective, to try to see if we can think differently, because you look at these decisions and you see how they impact us. It makes me really want to examine the next group of politicians and how they're going to make decisions and what decisions they've made in their past and how did they learn from those decisions. In fact, maybe there'll be room in Equal Matters and we could talk to some of these politicians about, because it's just not room in most media spaces because it just moves too fast. But when it comes to politics, politicians, more depth the better. Which is why we take the view from above, because this is creating awareness, and this awareness is creating understanding, because that first step of awareness is really the key to being in control of your life, to putting yourself in the driver's seat. And that awareness of what's happening in this country does the same thing, because now it allows you to take some action. Share this knowledge. Tell your friends. Share this podcast. and say, hey, just take a listen to this, and I'd love to discuss it with you after, because how do we have our presidents take a look at decisions like something simple, like funding the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and really think twice about that, and really wonder what's going to happen 5 or 10 or 15 years down the line, understanding that you can't predict everything. Bad things happen all the time. I can't look back at these decisions and say they were all wrong. That's unfair. Number one, because I didn't make them. Number two, because they're incredibly difficult decisions, which is the point in examining them. Were they good decisions? At the time, probably so. Arguably so, at least, because they were done. Looking back at them now, 44 years later in some cases, history tells a different story. History tells us that some of these decisions had major consequences, consequences that cost people lives. So this is your awareness. Awareness is that big, important step. Share the knowledge. Because this isn't to look back and say that, ha-ha, I told you so. This is meant to encourage us to think a little bit differently about politics. Getting back to that lesser of two evils. I refuse to believe that that's the only way forward. Oh, no. Got to fill in the circle for one of the lesser of two evils. You've done it. I've done it. You've talked about it. Your friends have talked about it. It's disheartening, but it doesn't have to be. Because in looking back at my own personal lessons, I understand that I was in charge of it all. Sometimes I didn't think so. Sometimes I made excuses. Oftentimes I made excuses. I did this because of that. Or, I used my parents' divorce as one of the major excuses for poor decision making. I can't help it. And when you get stuck in that I can't help it mode, that's when you repeat the decisions that you make, the decisions that have these consequences for 30 years, the decisions made in Afghanistan by a country that really wanted to fight a proxy war against the Russians, a proxy war that we're fighting again as Ukraine is defending itself against the Russians, a war bought and paid for by not just the United States, but many of our allies around the world.
After months of preparations, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has launched a major military operation against Ukraine. Speaking on national television, Mr. Putin urged Ukrainian troops to lay down their arms and go home. He warned that anyone who interfered in Russia's actions would face retaliation. Loud explosions have been now heard in Ukraine in lots of different cities as the Russian assault has begun. President Biden said that the world will hold Russia accountable for its aggression.
Because, like us as individuals, America is repeating the same pattern that we repeated or started in Afghanistan in 1979. Obviously, different circumstances, different countries, but the genesis is essentially the same. That in 1979, when Jimmy Carter decided to give money to the Mujahideen, it was because of the Russians. The Russians were our main adversaries at the time, the USSR, the Cold War, the communist bloc versus freedom. Same thing today. Russia, the communist bloc, the dictatorship, taking on the free country of Ukraine. So America and others come in to fund the Ukrainian defense, which again is understandable, arguably. But what's going to happen in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? What's going to happen in 22 years after the Russian invasion in the year 2022? Nobody knows, because those decisions have consequences, and these are decisions that ripple through time, creating consequences not just for us, but for, if you have kids, your grandkids, your great-grandkids. That's why these decisions are critically important, to think about them from above and to understand our personal responsibility for this country, because it was designed that way. The Founding Fathers, which we understand have been criticized quite a lot lately, but the whole intent was that Washington, D.C., politicians get their power from us. And I think in looking at these decisions this way, it's a reminder to all of us, myself included, to take more responsibility, personal responsibility for my role in this country. And maybe it's not getting involved in politics, although you certainly can. Maybe it's not funding politics. Maybe it's just having conversations with people. Because in the 23 years I've been a talk show host, I've come across some really amazing people from all walks of politics. I have friends that are progressives now, that are around 30 and younger. we had Representative Annalise Ortiz, who is a young progressive lawmaker from Arizona. I like her a lot. What the progressives have is basically the same thought that so many of us have, that the system, the government, the politicians that have made these decisions like funding Afghanistan or going to war with Iraq or not killing bin Laden, that is a system that isn't really working great for all of us. And it seems that we're just kind of apathetic about it. And I understand this because I was headed down a path of self-destruction. I was. I had this big, bad, I'm not good enough voice that always resonated in my head that I always believed. And because I believed it, I made it true. So I made decisions to reinforce that belief that I'm not good enough. It was only looking at those lessons, zooming out like we did today, that I started to see the pattern. And then when I saw the pattern, I could see what I could alter, what I could correct, what I could change, what I could try, what I could learn. That's the same point that we're doing today, because the patterns that we're repeating are very similar to the patterns that I repeated in my entire life up until about 4 or 5 or 6 years ago when I started to think differently. I started to understand what my role was, my responsibility in creating that pattern of bad decision-making that almost led to self-destruction. As a country, we're facing something very similar. We are facing what seems to me like apathy, despite this commonality that the current system is not working. So zooming out and looking at this decision-making patterns make us well aware of what's going on. We have a big election next year. We have an opportunity over the next 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 years to really inject this type of conversation into America. It's not for everybody. Not everybody's going to sit and hang around with us for an hour to talk about big decisions that politicians are making, but maybe there's ways we can reach them in different capacity, because that's what I think our personal responsibility is. If we care about this country, which we do, if we love this country, which we do, this is a country that has afforded me the opportunity to chase these dreams, to make these consequential decisions, to do the career that I wanted to do, to live the life that I wanted to live. That is the greatest gift that a human can have, in my opinion. And it only really exists this much in America. But if we get too apathetic and we continue to repeat the patterns that we have in our past, electing the same types of people who make the same types of decisions, do you really feel confident that we can meet the challenges of today, some of which are challenges made by decisions in the 22 years after that pivotal moment, 9:03 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time? Those decisions, war in Afghanistan, war in Iraq, the Patriot Act, is what we're going to examine next week. Because you look at not just the first 22 years of patterns, the next 22. And we'll see how they impact us all today, especially in light that we're in a very similar situation in 2023 than we were in 1979, given that Russia has invaded a country. So it's the perfect time to think about these lessons and apply them going forward. My name is Rob Hunter. This is Equal Matters, a show about realism, depth, and knowledge. Today, a pivotal moment that we talk about once per year, September 11th, 2001. Well, we'll do it a little different from here on out. Please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. And please share it with someone who might be interested in this conversation, because that public service is here for all of us to understand that we can make changes in this country, just like we can make changes in our own lives. So until next week, once again, my name is Rob Hunter. Good night.